The galaxy had always been afraid of humanity, even before humanity knew the galaxy existed. It started 120 years ago, when the first Valori scout ship entered the Sol system and found a species that should not have survived its own planet. Earth was a death world by galactic standards, a place of crushing gravity, extreme weather, predators with claws and venom, diseases that mutated faster than medicine could chase them, an ocean so deep and dark that no sane species would ever dare to swim in them. And yet there they were, humans, not only surviving, but thriving and building and dreaming of the stars. The Valori Scout transmitted its findings back to the Galactic Council, and the report caused panic in 17 different species before lunch. Humans were persistent predators who could chase prey for days without stopping. They could survive injuries that would kill most species twice over. They healed broken bones and kept fighting, emotionally, with anything, animals, machines, even each other, in ways so deep that they would walk into fire for someone they loved. They had fought wars among themselves for thousands of years, and each war made them more dangerous, more creative, more ruthless. The Council looked at this report and made a decision that would shape the next century. They would not fight humanity, they would invite them in, and then they would put a leash on them. The Terran Accords were presented to humanity as a gift, a seat at the galactic table, trade routes and technology, and the wonders of 1,000 alien civilizations. All humanity had to do was agree to a few reasonable conditions. Limit their fleet to a small defensive force. Stop developing new weapons. Allow Council inspectors to monitor their military installations. And accept the title of Provisional Species, which meant they could speak in the Council chamber but never vote. Humanity accepted. Ambassador Elara Vasquez, 26 years old when she first walked into the Council chamber on the station called Helix Prime. She remembered the way the alien delegates looked at her, some with curiosity, some with pity, and more than a few with barely hidden fear. She smiled at all of them. She shook every hand and tentacle and claw that was offered. She learned their languages and their customs and their favorite drinks. She laughed at their jokes, even when the jokes were about her species. That was 20 years ago. Now Elara was 46, and tired in a way that no amount of sleep could fix. She had spent 2 decades being the calm voice in the room, the reasonable one, the human who proved that her kind could be trusted. She had swallowed insults that would have made lesser diplomats declare war. She had watched her people be treated as something between a curiosity and a threat, and she had smiled through all of it, because the alternative was worse. But lately the smiling had become harder. Valori hegemony controlled the Council the way a puppet master controlled strings. They were an ancient species, tall and elegant, with silver skin and eyes like polished gems. They spoke softly and carried the weight of 10,000 years of civilization in every word. They believed with absolute certainty that they were the rightful leaders of the galaxy, and most species had learned long ago that agreeing with them was easier than fighting. High Chancellor Malus Drovan was the current head of the Valori, and she ruled the Council with a voice like silk wrapped around steel. She had never once raised her voice in the chamber. She had never needed to. When Malus spoke, species listened. When Malus decided, the galaxy obeyed. And Malus had decided that humanity needed to be brought to heel once more. The new resolution was called the Demilitarization Mandate, and it landed on Elara's desk like a bomb wrapped in polite language. The Council was requiring humanity to decommission 60% of its already reduced fleet. The justification was something about evolving security models and proportional defense frameworks, but Elara could read between the lines. The Valori were afraid. Again, something had spooked them. Maybe a new intelligence report, maybe a rumor, maybe just the old familiar terror of what humans could become if they were ever truly unleashed. Elara stood before the Council and made her case. She was eloquent and precise and passionate. She cited every treaty and every agreement and every promise the Council had made. She reminded them that humanity had honored every term of the Accords for over a century. She asked them, practically begged them, to reconsider. High Chancellor Malus listened politely and then called for a vote. The resolution passed 11-1. Humanity's voice did not count. Alara walked out of the chamber with her back straight and her expression calm. She nodded to the delegates she passed in. The corridor. She made it all the way to her private office before she allowed her hands to shake. She sat at her desk for a long time, staring at nothing. Then she opened a secure channel, one that was buried under so many layers of encryption that even the Rithani intelligence brokers could not crack it, and she sent a message to Earth. They are tightening the leash again. How much longer do we let them? The reply came from Admiral Cale Drennan, a man whose name appeared in no public record, and whose face had never been broadcast on any screen. He was 63 years old, with gray hair and steady hands, and eyes that had seen things he would never speak about. He commanded a project that officially did not exist, a project that every human leader for the past 100 years had quietly funded and protected and prayed would never be needed. Project Prometheus. Hidden in the deep black between stars, in systems that appeared on no map, humanity had been building. In hollowed-out asteroids, and cloaked orbital platforms, and underground facilities on barren moons, they had been preparing ships by the thousands. Weapons that the Council had banned, and humanity had built anyway, and then improved beyond anything the galaxy had ever imagined. Technology that would make the Vylori's proudest warships look like children's toys. Humanity had signed the Accords, and they had honored every visible term. But they had also looked at the galaxy, at the politics and the power games, and the way the strong devoured the weak, and they had made a quiet promise to themselves. Never again would they be at the mercy of anyone. Admiral Drennan read Alara's message, and he typed his response slowly and carefully, the way he did everything. As long as it takes, but not one day longer. He closed the channel and turned to look at the tactical display that covered an entire wall of his command center. Thousands of green dots glowed in the darkness. Each one a ship, a weapon, a promise. Humanity smiled at the galaxy, and the galaxy thought it understood what that smile meant. It did not. New Meridian was the kind of world that made people believe in miracles. It sat in a quiet corner of human space, a green and blue jewel orbiting a gentle yellow star. 18 million people called it home, and every single one of them would tell you it was the most beautiful place in the galaxy. The skies were wide and clean, and the sunsets painted the clouds in shades of gold and violet that no artist could ever capture. The oceans were warm, and the forests were tall, and the cities were built with care and love by people who had traveled across the stars to find a place where their children could grow up safe. Children were everywhere on New Meridian, in the schools that lined the hillsides, in the parks where they played under trees brought from old Earth, in the hospitals where new mothers held their babies for the first time and cried because the future finally felt like something worth hoping for. Governor Amara Osei had led New Meridian for 12 years, loved every centimeter of it. She was a tall woman with dark skin and kind eyes, and a laugh that could fill a room. She knew the names of the shopkeepers in the capital city. She visited the farming districts every spring to help with the harvest. She read stories to children at the colony's library every Sunday afternoon, because she believed that a leader who forgot about stories had no business leading anyone. When the council's announcement arrived, Governor Osei read it 3 times because she could not believe what she was seeing. The Galactic Council had declared that New Meridian and the entire star system it occupied now fell within a newly designated Vylori administrative zone. The justification was a set of ancient star charts that the Valori claimed proved the region had once belonged to their ancestors. Humanity was given 90 days to voluntarily relocate the colony's entire population of 18 million people. 90 days to abandon their homes, their schools, their hospitals, their farms, their graveyards where they had buried their loved ones. 90 days to pack up everything they had built over 40 years and leave, because the Valori had drawn a new line on a map. Ambassador Elara Vasquez fought it with everything she had. She filed legal challenges. She presented counter-evidence showing that the star charts were incomplete and misinterpreted. She called in favors from every species that had ever shown humanity an ounce of goodwill. She stood in the council chamber and spoke for 4 hours straight, laying out her case with the precision of a surgeon and the fire of someone who knew that millions of lives hung on her words. The council listened politely and then voted. The resolution passed 11-1. Humanity's voice did not count. It never counted. The 90 days passed, and humanity did not leave. Governor Osei stood before her people and told them that New Meridian was their home, and no one, not the Valori, not the Valori. Council, not anyone, had the right to take it from them. The crowd cheered, and for a brief moment, it felt like courage might be enough. It was not. The Valori peacekeeping fleet arrived on a Tuesday morning. 32 warships led by High Marshal Taven Solrath, aboard his flagship, the Dominion of Order. Solrath was everything the Valori aspired to be. Tall, silver-skinned, immaculate in his white uniform, utterly certain that the universe had been built for his species to command. He had never lost a battle. He had never questioned an order. He had never once looked at an alien species and seen anything other than something lesser. He transmitted his ultimatum to Governor Osei: surrender the colony within 6 hours, or face enforcement action. Amara Osei looked at the faces of her people, the farmers and teachers and doctors and children, and she transmitted her response. This is our home. We are not leaving. Solrath was not angry. Annoyed defiance from lesser species was expected. It simply needed to be corrected. He ordered a demonstration strike on what his tactical officers identified as an agricultural district in the Northern Hemisphere. A show of force to remind the humans of their place. But the tactical data was wrong. The district was not empty. It was home to nearly 3 million people, families who had been moved there during the evacuation preparations. Concentrated in emergency shelters and community centers because they thought the shelters would keep them safe. The orbital bombardment lasted 9 minutes. When it was over, 2,300,000 people were dead. Entire neighborhoods had been turned to glass. Schools had been vaporized, with children still inside them. Hospitals had collapsed on patients who were too sick to run. Shelters that families had huddled in, believing they were protected, had become tombs. Governor Amara Osei survived. The other side of the planet, when the sky lit up. She watched the footage from the Northern Hemisphere, and she did not speak for a very long time. When she finally opened her mouth, the only sound that came out was a scream that the people who heard it would never forget. The footage leaked within hours. Someone, no one ever found out who, broadcast it across every communication channel in the galaxy. Every species saw it. The burning fields, the shattered cities, the small shoes, half buried in the ash. The Valori response was delivered by High Chancellor Melis Drovan herself, in a statement so cold it could have frozen stars. She called the strike an unfortunate miscalculation resulting from human non-compliance. She expressed deep concern for the loss of life. She reminded the galaxy that humanity had been given every opportunity to comply peacefully. The Galactic Council issued a statement. The statement used words like regrettable and tragic and under review, and it meant absolutely nothing. The Council did nothing, because the Council had never done anything that the Valori did not approve of. and the Valori did not consider 2 million dead humans to be a matter worth losing sleep over. On Earth, the broadcast played on every screen, in every home, in every city, on every continent. And for one long, terrible moment, the entire planet went silent. Fathers turned off their screens and sat with their heads in their hands. Mothers held their children so tightly that the children squirmed and asked what was wrong. Old soldiers, who had served in peacetime, stared at the images and felt something ancient and terrible waking up inside them. Something that humanity had spent centuries trying to tame. Something that the galaxy had always feared, but never truly understood. In the halls of the United Terran Parliament, a single motion was raised by a representative whose own sister had been on New Meridian. The motion was called Resolution 7702. The revocation of the Terran Accords. It meant that every promise humanity had made to the galaxy, every limit on their fleet, every restriction on their weapons, every chain they had willingly wrapped around themselves, was now void. The vote was called. It passed unanimously. Not a single abstention, not a single moment of hesitation, not a single voice raised in opposition. Every representative from every nation on Earth and every colony in human space voted yes. Some of them were crying as they did it, not because they were sad, but because they knew what it meant. They knew what was coming. In a facility buried deep beneath the ice of a moon that had no name, Admiral Cale Drennan received the notification. He read it once. He closed his eyes for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, he thought about the children in the shelters on New Meridian who had been told they would be safe. Then he opened a secure channel to every hidden Prometheus station across human space, every shipyard, every weapons platform, every carrier group waiting in the dark between stars. His message was one word: awaken. And in the black silence of 100 dense systems, the lights began to turn on. Galaxy expected fire, but instead it got silence. In the 6 weeks following Resolution 7702, humanity simply vanished from the galactic stage. Embassies closed overnight, with human diplomats packing their things and boarding ships without saying goodbye. Trade vessels that had been hauling goods between human ports and alien markets turned around and went home. Communication channels that had been open for over a century went dark, one by one, like candles being snuffed out in a long hallway. At first, the council found it amusing. "They are sulking," said Delegate Moran of the Thessic Union at a council session, and several other delegates laughed. "Give them a few weeks, and they will come crawling back with a new ambassador and fresh apologies. They always do." High Chancellor Melis Drovan did not laugh, but she did allow herself a thin smile. She had dealt with humanity for decades, and she believed she understood them. They were emotional creatures, ruled by their feelings. They would rage for a while, and then their rage would burn out, and they would remember how much they needed the Council's trade routes and technology and protection. They would come back. They always came back. High Marshal Solrath was even less concerned. He had returned to Valori space as a hero, the commander who had reminded a lesser species of its place. The fact that 2 million humans had died barely registered in his mind as anything more than an administrative outcome. He had already moved on to planning the full occupation of New Meridian and the surrounding systems. But not everyone in the galaxy was so comfortable with the silence. Spy Master Osk of the Rithani Collective had not slept in 11 days. The Rithani were the galaxy's information brokers, a small, cautious species with enormous ears and even bigger intelligence networks. They did not fight wars. They did not take sides. They simply watched and listened and sold what they learned to. Whoever could pay the Rithani had survived for thousands of years by knowing things before anyone else did. And right now, Osk knew something that was keeping him awake at night. His agents had been detecting anomalies, deep space energy signatures in systems that were supposed to be empty. Ghost signals bouncing off relay stations in regions where no ship should be operating. Supply chain disruptions across human territory that suggested industrial mobilization on a scale that made no sense, unless humanity had been hiding an industrial capacity far beyond what anyone believed they possessed. Osk ran the numbers 7 times because he thought he must be making a mistake. He was not. He traveled to Helix Prime personally and requested an emergency audience with the Council. He stood in the Great Chamber, small and gray and trembling slightly, and he told them what he had found. "You need to understand what you have done," he said, and his voice was steady, even though his hands were not. "We have been watching humanity for over a century. We have tracked every ship they built, every factory they opened, every research station they funded. And I am telling you now, the numbers do not add up. They never added up." He paused and looked around the chamber at the faces of delegates, who were already growing bored. "Humanity has been building in secret for 100 years, he continued. "The fleet you see, the one limited by the Terran Accords, that is not their real fleet. It never was. Their real fleet is hidden, and it is vast beyond anything this council has ever faced. You did not put a leash on a pet. You put a muzzle on a predator, and now you have given it a reason to bite." The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Delegate Moran laughed again. "Rithani paranoia," he said. "Humans are clever. I will grant them that. But they are a young species with limited resources. They cannot possibly have—" Voice cracked with frustration. "I am telling you what my agents have confirmed. The energy signatures alone suggest a fleet numbering in the tens of thousands. And those are only the ones we have detected. There could be more. There could be many more." High Chancellor Malus studied Osk with her silver eyes for a long moment. Then she waved her hand in dismissal. "We appreciate the Rithani Collective's diligence," she said. "But we will not be frightened by ghost stories. The humans are a provisional species with a small fleet and limited capabilities. If they choose to test the Council's resolve, they will learn the same lesson that every defiant species has learned." Osk stared at her. He opened his mouth to argue further, and then he closed it. He had done what he came to do. He had warned them. He turned and walked out of the chamber, and as the great doors closed behind him, he whispered to himself, "You fools." Was well underway. In a hollowed-out asteroid designated Prometheus Station 7, Admiral Drennan stood on the command bridge of a ship that had never seen sunlight. The carrier was called the Wrath of Meridian, renamed the day after the bombardment, and it was the largest warship humanity had ever built. Around him, the station was alive with activity. Thousands of crew members moved with purpose and precision, loading weapons, running system checks, calibrating targeting arrays that could track a single ship across light years. The air hummed with energy and intent. Drennan reviewed the fleet manifests on his display. 42,000 warships spread across 116 hidden stations. Battle cruisers fitted with directed singularity warheads that could tear holes in space-time. Stealth destroyers coated in phase-cloaking technology that made them invisible to every known sensor system. Fighter carriers that could launch swarms of AI-coordinated attack craft faster than any organic pilot could react. And then there were the weapons that had no names yet. Experimental systems that Drennan scientists had been developing in secret for decades. Things that the galaxy had no framework to understand, let alone defend against. He thought about Alara, and the decades she had spent smiling and shaking hands and swallowing her pride so that humanity could buy time. He thought about Governor Osei screaming on New Meridian. He thought about the children in the shelters. He did not allow himself to feel rage. Not yet. Rage was a tool, and like all tools, it needed to be used at the right moment. On the same day across the galaxy, Ambassador Alara Vasquez sat alone in a small ship, drifting in neutral space. She had one final task before the silence ended. She recorded a message and transmitted it on every open frequency to every species and every station and every ship in the galaxy. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She spoke. Calmly and clearly, the way she had always spoken in the council chamber. This message is addressed to the Galactic Council, and to every species that sits within its halls. My name is Alara Vasquez, and for 20 years, I have been humanity's voice in your chamber. For 20 years, I have asked for fairness and been given excuses. I have asked for justice and been given silence. I have asked for peace and been given conditions that no free species should ever accept. She paused and took a breath. What follows is a record of every treaty the Council has violated against humanity. Every promise that was broken, every law that was bent, every time we came to you in good faith and were turned away, every time we asked to be treated as equals and were reminded of our place. The list was long. It took nearly an hour to read. Every incident was documented with dates and evidence, and the names of the council members who had authorized each violation. It was not an accusation. Delivered in anger. It was a case built with the patience and precision of a species that had been keeping records for a very long time. When the list was finished, Ilara looked into the camera one final time. "We gave you every chance," she said. "Remember that." The transmission ended. Across the galaxy, communication officers played it back. Species that had ignored humanity for decades listened in growing unease. The Valori High Command dismissed it as propaganda. But in the quiet corners of 100 worlds, people began to feel something they had not felt in a long time. Fear. And then the sensors started screaming. In the Korath system, the Valori's primary defensive corridor, a patrol ship detected a single anomaly on its long-range scanners. Then 2, then 10, then 100. Then the entire screen turned white with contacts, and the officer on duty could not breathe. Across the galaxy, in hundreds of systems simultaneously, human ships began to decloak. They appeared like ghosts stepping out of shadows. Massive carriers and sleek destroyers, and battle cruisers bristling with weapons that no one had ever seen before. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. The darkness between the stars was suddenly full of light and metal and fury. On a small Aurelian listening post near the border, a young communications officer named Fessa watched her screen fill with contacts so numerous that her computer could not count them fast enough. Her hands trembled as she reached for the emergency broadcast button. "Gods above," she whispered to no one. "There are so many of them. Where were they hiding all of these?" No one answered her. The silence was over. The war lasted 3 months, and it changed everything. It began at the Korath Gate, a massive region of fortified space that the Valori had spent centuries turning into the most heavily defended choke point in the galaxy. Weapons platforms the size of small moons hung in the void, surrounded by minefields and sensor nets, and patrol fleets that never slept. Behind them waited the largest armada the Valori hegemony had ever assembled. 8,000 warships crewed by the finest officers in their navy, arranged in a formation that military scholars across the galaxy had declared unbreakable. High Marshal Solrath commanded the defense personally from the bridge of his flagship. He had chosen the Korath Gate because he wanted humanity to crash against it like water against stone. He wanted the galaxy to watch the humans break themselves on Valori's strength, and he wanted to be the one standing in the center of the victory. He got his wish about the watching part. Human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at exactly 0600 Galactic Standard Time, and the first thing every sensor operator in the Valori fleet noticed was that their screens could not display all the contacts. There were too many. The computers tried to count, and the numbers kept climbing past every estimate that Valori intelligence had ever produced. 42,000 warships. They filled the void like a wall of steel and light. Carriers longer than cities, destroyers moving in perfect synchronized patterns, battle cruisers with weapons that glowed with energies no Valori scientist could identify. And at the center of the formation, The massive bulk of the Wrath of Meridian moved forward like a mountain given purpose. Admiral Drennan opened a single communication channel. "This is Admiral Cale Drennan of the United Terran Navy. You are occupying a defensive position in contested space. You have 60 seconds to power down your weapons and surrender. Will be treated with dignity, and your wounded will receive medical care. The clock starts now." Solrath did not respond to the message. He ordered his fleet to open fire. The Battle of Korath Gate lasted 11 hours. It should not have lasted that long, but Drennan was not interested in simply destroying the Valori fleet. He was interested in dismantling it, systematically, precisely, and in full view of every species that was watching. And they were all watching. The human fleet moved with a coordination that bordered on terrifying. Individual ship captains made decisions in fractions of a second, guided by AI systems that processed battlefield data faster than any organic mind could follow. Destroyer groups would appear from phase cloak, strike a target, and vanish before return fire could reach them. Carrier groups launched swarms of fighter craft that moved like flocks of birds, thousands of individual units acting as one organism, adapting to every countermove. Valori attempted. The Valori fought bravely. That much could not be denied. Their crews held their positions and fired their weapons and died at their stations because they believed in their empire and their commander and their place in the universe. But bravery was not enough. Not against this. Not against a species that had spent a century preparing for exactly this moment. One by one, the Valori warships went dark. Some surrendered, and human ships immediately moved in to secure the crews and provide medical assistance to the wounded. Others fought to the last, and were destroyed with a clinical efficiency that horrified the watching galaxy. Not because humanity was cruel, but because humanity was so terrifyingly precise. There was no wasted fire, no stray shots hitting civilian stations, no wild barrages aimed at general areas. Every shot went exactly where it was intended, and nowhere else. When it was over, the Korath Gate belonged to humanity. They had lost 6% of their fleet. The Valori had lost everything. The galaxy held its breath, and then it began to panic. Species that had mocked humanity weeks ago scrambled to declare neutrality. Ambassadors who had laughed at Alara Vasquez in the council chamber suddenly remembered urgent business on their homeworlds. Border systems were evacuated. Military commanders across a dozen species watched the battle footage and quietly began updating their threat assessments. Not because they thought humanity would attack them, but because they realized with sickening clarity that if humanity wanted to attack them, there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. But humanity did not attack them. Admiral Drennan pushed forward into Valori space, and the campaign that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Humanity did not burn worlds. They did not bomb cities. They did not target civilian populations. Instead, they systematically dismantled the Valori war machine. Surgical precision. Shipyards were destroyed after their workers were given 6 hours to evacuate. Command stations were disabled, not obliterated, with targeted strikes that knocked out weapons and engines while leaving life support intact. Supply lines were cut so cleanly that Valori commanders found themselves unable to fuel their ships, but still perfectly able to feed their crews. Communication relays were seized rather than destroyed, so that the Valori people could continue to receive news and information throughout the war. And after every engagement, humanity broadcast the same message: civilians will not be harmed. Surrender and you will be treated with dignity. They meant it. Every prisoner was fed and given medical care. Every wounded Valori soldier was treated by human doctors who worked just as hard to save alien lives as they would have worked to save human ones. When human Marines boarded a disabled Valori station and found a nursery full of frightened alien children, the Marines sat down on the floor and handed out ration bars. And one of them, a sergeant named Torres whose daughter had died on New Meridian, pulled out a small stuffed animal and gave it to the smallest child. The footage of Sergeant Torres went across the galaxy faster than any battle report. The contrast was devastating, and it was deliberate. The Valori had killed 2,300,000 civilians, including children, and called it a miscalculation. Humanity captured an empire and offered the survivors medical aid and stuffed animals. The propaganda war was over before it began. Every species in the galaxy could see the difference, and no amount of Valori rhetoric could erase it. High Marshal Solrath refused to accept it. He retreated to the Valori homeworld, a shining planet called Valor Prime, and rallied every remaining ship he could find. He assembled a fleet of 3,000 vessels, crewed by loyalists and volunteers and true believers, who would rather die than surrender to a lesser species. He stood on the bridge of his flagship and broadcast a speech to his fleet and to the galaxy. "We are the Valori," he declared. "We have ruled these stars for 10,000 years. We will not bow to animals who crawled out of the mud on a death world. If this is our last stand, then let history remember that we stood." The human fleet arrived 12 hours later. The Battle of Valor Prime was shorter than Korath Gate, but it was the engagement that would be studied in military academies for centuries. The Valori fought with desperate courage, throwing everything they had at the human line, and the human line did not move. It absorbed the assault like stone absorbing rain, and then it pushed forward with methodical, unstoppable force. In the heart of the battle, Captain Juno Marin commanded a strike group of 12 destroyers. She was 34 years old, with red hair cut short, and eyes that had not smiled since New Meridian. Her parents had lived in the northern hemisphere of the colony. Her younger brother had been a teacher at one of the schools that were vaporized. Her grandmother had been in one of the shelters. Marin's strike group punched through the defensive screen around Solrat's flagship with a maneuver so aggressive that even the human tactical AI flagged it as high risk. She did not care. Her destroyers disabled the flagship's engines and weapon systems in under 4 minutes, and then she gave an order that surprised everyone, including her own crew. "Prepare boarding parties. We are taking that ship intact." Her Marines stormed the flagship against fierce resistance and fought their way to the bridge deck by deck, corridor by corridor. When they breached the command center, they found High Marshal Solrath standing at his console with a sidearm in his hand. He looked at the human soldiers, and for the first time in his life, he understood what fear felt like. Alive. When the after-action reports were filed, someone asked Captain Marin why she had risked a boarding action when she could have simply destroyed the flagship. It would have been safer and faster, and no one would have blamed her. Marin looked at the officer who asked the question, and her voice was flat and hard and quiet. "Because a dead man cannot answer for what he did, and our dead deserve answers." The Valori hegemony surrendered the next day. Their homeworld was intact. Their cities were unburned. Their civilians were alive and unharmed, and many of them were being treated by human medical teams who had arrived within hours of the ceasefire. But their fleet was gone. Their empire was broken. Their seat on the Galactic Council, the throne they had occupied for 10,000 years, was empty. And across the galaxy, every species that had ever looked at humanity and seen something small and manageable and safe finally understood what the Rythani had tried to tell them: they had never been safe. Humanity had simply chosen to be kind. And when that choice was taken from them, the galaxy learned what happened next. The galaxy waited for the human empire to be born. Every species expected it. History had taught them what came next. A great power falls, and the conqueror takes its place. The Valori had done it 10,000 years ago, when they crushed the old Aurelian Federation and built their hegemony on the ruins. The pattern was as old as civilization itself. The strong devour the weak, and then they sit on the throne and dare anyone to knock them off. Humanity had just destroyed the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever known. They had 42,000 warships and weapons that could crack open planets. They had proven that no fleet could stand against them, and no defense could stop them. The throne was right there waiting for them. All they had to do was sit down. They did not sit down. 3 weeks after the Valori surrender, the Galactic Council reconvened for the first time since the war. The chamber on Helix Prime looked the same curved walls, the same tiered seating, the same great dome overhead that showed the stars. But everything else was different. Delegates who had once strutted into the room with confidence now walked in quietly with nervous glances at the human section. Seats that had been occupied by Valori loyalists were empty. Species that had not spoken in the chamber for decades suddenly found their voices. And at the center of it all, standing at the podium where she had been ignored and dismissed and silenced for 20 years, Ambassador Elera Vasquez looked out at the faces of a galaxy that was terrified of her species, and she did something that no one expected. She smiled. Not the diplomatic smile she had worn like armor for 2 decades. A real one. Tired and sad and honest, but real. "I know what you are expecting," she said. "You are expecting us to announce new terms for your surrender. You are expecting us to claim Valori space and install human governors over your worlds. Become what they were, only worse, because we have proven we are stronger." She paused and let the silence fill the chamber. "We are not going to do that." She activated a display behind her, and a document appeared on every screen in the chamber. It was long and detailed, and it had been written over the course of 3 weeks by human legal scholars, diplomats, ethicists, and representatives from every colony in human space, including the survivors of New Meridian. "This is the New Meridian Doctrine," Alara said. "It is not a treaty imposed by a victor on the defeated. It is a proposal, a framework for what this galaxy could become if we choose to build something better than what came before." The doctrine was comprehensive, and it was radical by galactic standards. It called for the complete restructuring of the Council, with equal voting rights for every member species, regardless of age, or military power, or economic influence. It established an independent judiciary for interstellar disputes, judges drawn from multiple species, with no single species holding a majority. It created binding protections for civilian populations during conflicts, with real enforcement mechanisms and real consequences for violations. It abolished the category of provisional species entirely. And at the very end, written in language so simple that no lawyer could twist it and no politician could misinterpret it, was a single amendment. No species shall be compelled to surrender its right to defend its people, ever. The chamber was silent for a long time. Then Delegate Resic of the Aurelian Republic stood up. Resic was old and small, and his species had been under the Valori shadow for longer than humanity had existed. He had watched the war from his homeworld, and he had wept, not from fear, but from something he had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. "The Aurelian Republic endorses the New Meridian Doctrine," he said, and his voice shook. Words were clear. One by one, other species followed. The Thesic Union, whose delegate had laughed at humanity weeks ago, voted yes, without making eye contact with anyone. The Kavari Shogunate endorsed it. The Drellian Confederacy endorsed it. Even species that had quietly supported the Valori during the war scrambled to add their names to the document, because they understood that the galaxy had changed, and they could either change with it or be left behind. The doctrine passed with the largest majority vote in the history of the Galactic Council. High Marshal Taven Solrath was brought to trial 1 month later. The trial was not held in a human court. Humanity had insisted on that. Solrath would be judged by an independent tribunal, made up of judges from 7 different species, with full access to evidence from both sides. The proceedings were broadcast across the galaxy, and every moment was open to public scrutiny. Solrath stood in the tribunal chamber in a simple, gray uniform stripped of his medals and his rank. He was still tall, and his silver skin still caught the light, but something had changed behind his eyes. The certainty was gone, replaced by something hollow and confused. The evidence was overwhelming. Tactical records showed that his officers had flagged the northern hemisphere of New Meridian as a populated area before the strike. Communication logs proved that he had received the warning and dismissed it. Testimony from surviving Valori bridge crew confirmed that he had ordered the bombardment, knowing there were civilians in the target zone. Solrath's defense argued that he was following established council protocols for enforcement actions against non-compliant species. The tribunal rejected this argument. He was convicted of crimes against sentient life and sentenced to spend the remainder of his existence in a detention facility on a neutral world. He would be treated humanely. He would not be tortured or executed. Had insisted on that too. When the sentence was read, Solrath looked across the chamber at Captain Juno Marin, who had come to observe the verdict. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not hatred, not forgiveness, but a kind of understanding that only people who have seen the worst of what power can do are able to share. Marin did not look away. She watched as Solrath was led from the chamber, and she thought about her brother, who had been a teacher, and her grandmother, who had been in a shelter, and she felt something that was not quite peace, but was close enough, for now. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy began to reshape itself around the New Meridian doctrine. Trade routes reopened, with humanity at their center, but not as a gatekeeper, as a partner. New diplomatic channels were established between species that had not spoken to each other in centuries. An interstellar medical corps was founded, with human doctors working alongside alien physicians to bring healthcare to neglected colony worlds. Humanity did not demand gratitude for any of it. They did not build monuments to their victory or rename conquered stars after human heroes. They built a memorial on New Meridian, a vast, quiet garden where 2,300,000 names were carved into white stone. And they asked the galaxy to remember. Not all of it was easy. Some species resented humanity's new influence. Others feared it. There were disputes and disagreements, and moments when the new system came close to breaking. But it held, because enough people in enough places believed that it was worth holding together. Spymaster Osk, of the Rathani Collective, visited Alara one evening in her office on Helix Prime. He had aged in the past few months. His enormous ears drooped a little more, and his eyes were tired. But there was a warmth in them that had not been there before. "I have a question," he said, settling into a chair that was slightly too large for him. One that the entire galaxy is asking, but no one has the courage to say out loud. Alara poured him a drink, something sweet and mild that the Rathani favored, and sat across from him. "Ask. You could have ruled everything," Osk said quietly. "After Koreth Gate, there was no force in the galaxy that could have stopped you. You could have taken the Valori's throne, and every world in their empire. You could have made every species bow to you, and they would have done it gladly, because they were too afraid to do anything else." He leaned forward. "Why did you not?" Alara was quiet for a long time. She looked out the window at the stars, the same stars she had watched from this office for 20 years, while the galaxy treated her people as something less than equal. "Because that was never the point," she said. "We did not fight to become what they were. We fought so that no one would ever have to be what we were, voiceless and powerless, and mourning our dead, while the galaxy looked away." Osk studied her face for a moment, and then he nodded slowly. He raised his glass. "To New Meridian," he said. "To New Meridian," Alara replied, and they drank together in the quiet of an office that overlooked a galaxy that was finally learning what it meant to be free. Years passed. The war became history, and then legend, and then something taught in classrooms across 1,000 worlds. Students learned about the Terran Accords, and the Violori hegemony, and the bombardment of New Meridian, and the fleet that appeared from nowhere, and the woman who stood at a podium and offered mercy when the galaxy expected conquest. In an interstellar academy on a station orbiting a blue gas giant, a young alien student named Lian sat in a lecture hall and listened to her professor talk about the war. She was Aurelian, small and bright-eyed, with the curiosity that her species was known for, and she had been studying human history for 2 years, questions she had never been able to answer. After the lecture, she approached her professor, a human man named David Chen who had gray at his temples and kind eyes, and a way of explaining things that made you feel like you were discovering the answers yourself. "Professor Chen," Lian said, "I understand what humanity did. I understand how they did it. But I do not understand why they waited so long. They had the power to fight back for decades. Why did they endure so much before they acted? Why did they let so many terrible things happen to them before they finally stood up?" Professor Chen looked at her for a long moment, and his expression was something between sadness and pride. He glanced at the wall of the classroom, where a memorial plaque hung, a small piece of white stone brought from the garden on New Meridian. 2,300,000 names, in letters too small to read from a distance, but each one carved with care. "Because fury without restraint, destruction," he said softly. "We had to be sure, absolutely sure, that when we finally stood up, we stood for something worth standing for." Lian followed his gaze to the plaque, and she read the inscription at the bottom, a single line carved in human script, with translations in 47 galactic languages beneath it. "We remember so the stars never forget." She stood there for a long time, reading the names she could not pronounce, of people she had never met, who had lived on a world she had never visited. And finally, she understood.